the status of gun regulation across Australia, develop national best practice standards informed by expert advice, and promote transparency, integrity, harm prevention and public education. We thank the government for agreeing to do that extra good thing. Even before Bondi, the community had been calling for action on gun control. Polling by the Australia Institute showed that around 70% of Australians think gun laws should be strengthened to make it harder to get a gun. The tragedy of Bondi means we must not ignore those calls any longer. This moment is beyond politics. Our resolve to act is a test for our common humanity, and I hope that all of Parliament will join together to ensure that no one can walk the streets of Sydney or any Australian city with a high-powered gun. I'm proud on behalf of the Greens to support these gun law reforms today.
Thank you, Senator Waters. Senator McKenzie.
Very much, Madam President. And I think the over 1 million law-abiding firearm owners in this country need protection from the dirty deal done by the Greens political party, who have always sought to demonise hunters, sporting shooters, farmers, feral pest managers and environmentalists from doing what they should lawfully be able to do. And they've found a willing partner in a Prime Minister that sought to demonise law-abiding firearm owners in the wake of his flaccid, weak response to an Islamic terrorist attack on our shores. What was his first response? Wasn't to call out Islamic radical terrorism or extremism, which has now found terrorising expression on one of our most iconic landscapes. No, that wasn't the Prime Minister's first call. In fact, he is still yet to say those words. In the legislation we'll debate later today, doesn't even mention it. And yet here we are, literally driving the bus over 1 million lawful Australians who are going about their business, enjoying their sport, working hard, etc. And I just am so thankful that they have risen as one. They have said no to unfair gun law changes, and that is why I do seek leave from the chamber to table a non-conforming petition. And, Madam President?
I understand leave is
granted. Leave has been granted.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Where over 65,000 Australians have signed up to say no. We are not the problem here, Prime Minister, and you need to stop saying we are. The National Party and the Coalition are opposing these laws. And we don't make an apology for that at all, because we know it's not the gun that saw 15 lives lost, Jewish Australians targeted on the 14th of December. Australia was confronted with a brutal and senseless act of violence on Bondi. Innocent people going about their lives in a place that should have been safe and ordinary were murdered. Families shattered.
Senator, just a moment. I understand the agreement that was arrived at was you would have a bundle of the petitions on the desk, and the rest would remain on the trolleys.
So the agreement was that I would table a non-conforming petition.
And the agreement with the clerks was that they remain, you would have some on your desk and the others remain.
That wasn't agreed.
Well, I'm sorry, Senator McKenzie. That is what I am requesting. So please put the rest back on the trolley, because I'm not, you're not in a debate with me, so put the rest back on the trolley. They need to be removed from the floor because that's safety. Well, not by you, because you need to continue your, well, you've got other senators there.
We're in a mess, and now we have the hottest country anywhere in the world.
Happy to do our own heavy lifting. Our nation was reminded once again that the forces of hatred, extremism and radical violence are not abstractions. They have real victims, real names and real consequences. The Coalition's message has been very clear and consistent. Anti-Semitism, terrorism, hate-fuelled violence in all their forms must be confronted, condemned and defeated.
We were in dead country.
Making law-abiding firearm owners your scapegoat is very convenient. It allows the Greens to do something they've wanted to do for a long time, but it does not get to the heart of the issue. And you've heard a lot from the Labor Party about what the real issue is. The reality is the Coalition called for a Royal Commission after the Bondi attack so that we could understand how this Islamist had firearms in his home. He should never have had access to firearms under existing laws.
Order.
And we need to find out who knew what when, why these firearms weren't removed before 15 innocent Australians had to pay the ultimate price.
About 20
This
years now,
bill seeks to instigate a national gun buyback. We have state and territory governments who have made it very, very clear that they do not see this as an appropriate response. I'm happy for these to stay in front of me, if you don't mind. We've got the other 60,000 signatures behind us not being out in front of everybody, so I think we've found an agreement. The amendments are required to make the proposed I'm going to be moving on behalf of the Coalition amendments. Amendments are required to make the proposed buyback more consistent under 1996. A buyback where the agreement struck on the 10th of May 1996, all states and territory jurisdictions agreed to a process to create and amend firearms legislation, insomuch as this would, for the first time, create consistent and agreed processes that would manage all elements of firearm legislation across Australia. The states and territories being responsible for that, for various firearm acts. And the Commonwealth is responsible for changes to the importation and end-user certification. That actually reflects our Constitution. And for the first time since 1996, the federal government has decided to abandon that process that we all agreed to over 25 years ago, and had made us the envy of the world when it came to strict gun laws that still allowed lawful Australians to participate in their sport, farmers to practice animal husbandry, environmentalists to ensure that feral pests were managed, and Olympians to win gold medals, of which we're all very, very proud, but you can't do that if you're not getting young people through the pipeline of this great sport. The advice I have is that if you really want to participate in the over 60 all the disciplines available in the firearm disciplines, you'd need over 50 different guns to actually participate in everything. That's like banning your 3-iron, your putter and your wedge and trying to get your handicap in golf under 20. But after this federal government, after 2 meetings of the state and territory attorney generals and police ministers, the proposals of the Albanese government were comprehensively rejected by the majority of the signatories to the National Firearm Agreement. Instead of accepting the result of the process, state ministers saying, well, thanks very much for your advice, Mr Albanese, but we've got it from here, which has been the system for 30 years. The Albanese government has chosen to use the powers of the federal government to prohibit certain firearms by denying import certification, leaving Australia in a situation that a firearm that has previously been approved will now be banned. You're leaving us in a situation that things that have been prohibited by the federal government is still able to be legally owned and purchased in the majority of Australian states and territories. These guys, helped by the Greens, actually don't know how this works. The National Firearm Agreement, sadly, is an agreement in word only. By trashing this most important agreement that was arrived to, thanks to the leadership of John Howard and Tim Fischer, is an agreement in word only. The future of firearms management in Australia has now been set back many years, and instead of the envy of the world, we are now the laughingstock. Real leadership would dictate using the National Firearms Agreement as the agreed pathway forward and accepting the outcome of that process. And if the majority of states said no thanks, then that, I'm sorry, Prime Minister, is how government works. It's how our Constitution works. But here we are, debating a bill which has several flaws, and that is why I will be moving amendments on behalf of the Coalition. With respect to these amendments, there is no detail around this buyback. Which firearms and equipment would be banned by the states? How many guns can a person own? Is there going to be fair market compensation paid to lawful firearm owners? Are there many dealerships that operate around the country who have millions of dollars worth of stock sitting on the shelves right now that will be unable to be sold or used, going to be fairly compensated? Our Constitution requires federally for that to happen. The amendment sheet that will be circulated will also provide that compensation be available for those businesses' loss. I'll also be moving amendments that require states and territories to give notice by March, 3rd of March 2026, that if they're going to participate in this gun buyback or not. Because when it comes to the state of Victoria and when it comes to the state of South Australia, both of them are going to state elections. Firearm owners in those states need to know, is Jacinta Allen going to throw the hundreds of thousands of law-abiding firearm owners, including her husband, under the bus before the election? Is Premier Malinowskis going to tell South Australian firearm owners what he's going to do before his election? Firearm owners deserve transparency in this so they can put their vote behind the National Party and the Liberal Party, who support their lawful right to hold firearms and to participate in our society lawfully. Amendment sheet 3595 will seek to delete the proposed ban on assisted repeating and straight pull repeating firearms. These are not semi-automatic weapons and in most states are subject to a genuine reason process. So you can't just walk in and buy one. You've got to have a genuine reason. Knowing this, and Senator Little and I were talking about, if you're out hunting deer, you don't need a repeating rifle. But if you're out hunting feral pigs, you do, because weight shots are not only for the importers, but for Home Affairs and for state agencies who are going to have to assess all these
We have more money being invested.
I'll be using a bill that seeks to support the legitimate prohibition of downloading instructions on a carriage service for 3D printing of illegal and unlawful firearms. We support that measure, but there doesn't seem to be a clear defence for lawful firearm owners to seek information from the internet relating to reloading, spent ammunition or access to manuals for firearms a person lawfully owns. We need to have a merit review process when it comes to adverse criminal intelligence assessments, which currently isn't in the bill. And I will be moving an amendment that provides clarity that the provisions in the bill do not effectively ban the import of pistols, which I'm told will have severe and unintended impacts on our elite competition and sporting shooting that goes on in clubs right around the country in a very safe and secure environment.
Well, I think I have a lot of messages for Davos, but the primary
The government originally proposed to impose the restrictions worn on equipment such as shooting vests and cartridge belts, and I'd like to give a huge shout out to SSAA and Beretta, who provided me with a shooting vest yesterday. I was able to say, not allowed to have clothing that would allow you to have more than 30 cartridges. Well, there goes your Olympic vests. You need to be able to carry over 50 cartridges.
So I think the message in
After
Davos,
putting that up on the internet, guess what? Government's changed, because firearm owners are saying this is nonsensical. So thank you to the government who's doing that. The failure to properly distinguish between legal firearms, which are used safely and securely, and the acts of terrorists will demonise the over a million people. The petition I'm tabling today has over 65,000 law-abiding Australians who are standing up to the Labor Party and saying no. I want to make it very, very clear that the Coalition supports the firearms registry process. We don't know why we're still waiting for it to be implemented. The government has been in charge of this process for over 4 years. And yet here we are announcing it as if it's something new. The reality is they didn't put money towards it. And that is why It hasn't been seen as a priority. Let's make sure that we can do better next time. We know that the Labor Party's dirty deal with the Green is a step back. And as I've made outline, it is in contravention to the National Firearms Agreement that we all signed up to in 1996. And for the Prime Minister to say he's just like John Howard shows what a mockery this is. John Howard and Tim Fischer took on their own constituency, took on the farmers, took on the sporting shooters, who are typically coalition voters, in an effort to address the mass shooting at Port Arthur. This Prime Minister has failed to take on his own constituency. In the Labor Party, in Western Sydney suburbs, that is the cause of this shooting event. I also move my second reading amendment as circulated in the chamber. I would like to move that. This is an amendment that requests that this legislation goes to a Senate inquiry in the Legal and Constitutional Committee for 4 weeks. We need to have the chance for firearm owners to have their say, for the National Rifle Association, CIFA, SSAA, Shooters Union, Clay Target Association, Target Pistols Australia, all of Gympie Pistol Club would also like to have a say, to let the people, the experts and our agencies have input into this firearm legislation so it's actually not harming the people it's supposed to protect.
Senator Mulholland.
President, 15 innocent lives were tragically lost at Bondi Beach. They were gunned down by 2 terrorists. One of the shooters had a firearm licence and he was legally in possession of 6 weapons. Australia's current firearms laws entitled that gunman to own an uncapped number of guns. This bill will stop that. He was not an Australian citizen, and this bill will stop non-citizens from holding a firearm licence. This bill will also stop the importation of rapid-fire guns. These are sensible reforms in response to the Bondi massacre. They will protect our community and protect our law enforcement. These are important reforms for Queensland, where we have lost far too many police officers to criminals and murderers in possession of guns. So as someone who has spent most of my career working alongside police, today I say their names. Constable Matthew Arnold, Constable Rachel McCrew, Senior Constable Brett Fort, Detective Senior Constable Damien Leedy, Constable Brett Irwin, Senior Sergeant Perry Irwin, Senior Constable Norman Watt. Each of them a Queensland police officer murdered by a person with a gun while doing their job. So I say their names as a reminder that the gun debate is not an attack on law-abiding gun owners. It is about reducing risk. It is about safety. It is about protecting Australians and our law enforcement. You see, the idea that Australia is safe from guns is a myth. And the events of December 14 at Bondi are a shocking and painful reminder of that truth. The reality is that there are more guns on Australian streets now than when John Howard's original gun buyback scheme...
Order, Senator Mulholland. Senator Chisholm, on a point of order.
We listened in silence to Senator Mackenzie's speech. I'd ask the same for Senator Mulholland.
Indeed, Senator Chisholm, and senators should be in their seats if they must heckle. Senator Mulholland, you have the call.
There are more guns on Australian streets now than when John Howard's original gun buyback scheme took 650,000 guns off our streets in 1996. 1 in 30 Australians holds a firearm licence, according to research by the Australian Institute. And there are now more than 4 million registered firearms in Australia, an average of 4 guns per licence holder. And here's another myth that we need to confront, that the majority of the guns are in rural communities. They're not. The overwhelming majority are in the suburban streets and cities of Australia. This legislation clearly exempts farmers who need guns for legitimate purposes like pest control and livestock management. This is about keeping Australians safe from people who stockpile weapons in our suburbs to kill others. Like at the William Beeler siege in the Western Downs of Queensland, where police constables Rachel McGraw and Matthew Arnold were gunned down and killed with a neighbour, Alan Dare, and an officer, Randall Kirk, was injured by the gunfire. The shooters were fundamentalists, conspiracy theorists, and one of them was a registered gun owner. Days before the siege, he was able to buy ammunition in Queensland using a suspended gun licence from New South Wales. Obviously, we need to close this loophole to ensure we have a truly national firearm register with live data linked into intelligence agencies. In 2024, Queensland Police launched Operation Whiskey Firestorm in response to 3,290 firearm offences across Queensland. And the purpose of the operation was to get licensed gun owners to properly secure their firearms. Why? Because hundreds of guns are stolen from suburban homes in Queensland every year via break and enters and end up being used in violent, murderous crimes. Fortunately, the majority of gun owners audited were found to be compliant, and I commend the many responsible gun owners in Queensland for how seriously they take this responsibility. But there were still almost 110 gun owners who the police found with guns stored under beds and in cupboards, leaving them susceptible to theft or misuse. Not to mention the fact that in this country, a woman is killed every 9 days by a current or former partner, and it's estimated around 10 to 15% of those homicides involve firearms. So we cannot talk about guns without talking about the domestic violence and safety risk these present in our communities. And when Queensland saw upwards of 3,000 firearm offences in 2024 alone, we don't need to wait for someone else to die. We need to act now to make necessary change, and we need political courage. And nowhere is that more important than in Queensland. Queensland has the second highest number of registered firearms in Australia, with 1 million guns in circulation. And as a Queensland Senator, I feel enormous disappointment that our LNP state government is refusing to participate in the national buyback scheme. I have to ask myself why. Last month, the Courier Mail revealed that within hours of the Bondi massacre occurring, gun lobbyists contacted the LNP government, urging them to resist gun reforms. To the Queensland Premier and to the Queensland Police Minister, I say this: you cannot be tough on crime and soft on guns.
Thank you, Senator Mulholland. Senator Thorpe.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. I acknowledge that we're on Ngunnawal Ngambri country, sovereign custodians of the land, and sovereignty was never ceded to this colony. I welcome strengthened gun laws, but if we're serious about gun safety, accountability can't stop at just civilian firearms. Oversight, tracking and transparency must apply to all guns, including those issued to police, prison guards, security guards and defence personnel. I move the second reading amendment in my name, which calls on this Parliament to implement robust and nationally consistent oversight of firearms. The public has a right to know what firearms are imported into this country and who imports them, how they are stored and used, and what happens to them at the end of their life cycle. International evidence shows that firearms can and do move from police stockpiles into criminal markets when oversight is weak. Australia should be learning from that, not pretending it can't happen here. We already know that stolen firearms are the biggest source of illegal guns in this country, and that most guns used in crime are stolen guns. A recent report by the Australia Institute shows that approximately 2,000 firearms, 2,000 guns are stolen each year, averaging 1 every 4 hours. Just recently, firearms were stolen from police in Townsville. We've also seen evidence presented in court cases showing that weapons stolen from army facilities have been used to commit serious crimes, including murder and armed robberies. These are some of the few cases we know about, but there is no consistent public transparency around these incidents. It has also been reported that a police-issued firearm was allegedly used in the horrific domestic violence murder of Jesse Bird and Luke Davies, raising serious questions about the management and oversight of police weapons. Police defence armories remain largely opaque. That limits accountability and undermines our gun control framework. A national firearms register that excludes police weapons is incomplete. If the goal is public safety, then transparency has to be universal. This also leads to the point that the armoury and strength of police, in particular, is used against the very people they are supposed to protect. Whether it is violence against protests, standing against genocide and war crimes, or police deaths in custody. A 2020 Deakin University study showed that even though Australia has half the population size, they had more fatal shootings by police than the UK. Shame. Recently, we saw the shooting of Kumanjayi Walker by Northern Territory Police Officer Zachary Rolfe in Yuendumu. And also the shooting of 29-year-old Yamaji woman, JC, who was shot using hollow point bullets. They explode in your body. That's what a hollow point bullet is. That's what the police use in this country. They explode in your body. These bullets have been banned in international warfare by the 1899 Hague Declaration. This is why one of my amendments restricts law enforcement from importing hollow point bullets to use against civilians. We know that globally, purchases of militarised equipment is creating a new profitable market for defence contractors rather than really putting questions of public safety first. In a 2023 study led by Brown University Associate Professor of Political Science Rob Blair, studied a militarised crime intervention in Cali, Colombia, and found little evidence to support the idea that military policing reduces crime. Safety cannot be found through violent colonial institutions. More police, more cops, or more prisons, especially for First Nations people. On the hate crimes bill, I cannot support this bill. Racism, including anti-Semitism, is a real and serious problem in this country. But this legislation does not represent a good faith effort to combat hate and racism. It seems designed to suppress legitimate criticism of the State of Israel and to restrict protests and political expression, especially on the topic of genocide, and to create hierarchies in who deserves protection and who does not. This Parliament must genuinely commit to protecting everyone from hate and racism, not selectively, and not in ways that undermine fundamental rights or erase the foundational racism against my people. Expanding hate crimes law for a select few protected attributes and excluding religion leaves communities who continue to be affected by rising hate, violence and vilification at risk. There has been, and no one, you don't see this in the newspapers, especially in the right-wing Murdoch media, there has been a 2,297% increase in Islamophobic incidents reported to the Islamic Council of Victoria in 2025 alone. 2,297% increase. A recent incident where an imam and his wife were attacked, driven off the road and threatened with stabbing in Melbourne. There have been 33 Aboriginal deaths in custody just last year. And since the horrific attack at Bondi, we have shamefully seen attempts to blame the actions of two violent extremist men on the entire anti-genocide movement and on Muslim and Arab communities more broadly. No one's talking about violence of men in this debate. These false and dangerous claims fuel the very racism and Islamophobia this Parliament apparently wants to address. In the words of Jews Against the Occupation, to conflate the speech and actions of people motivated by deeply held convictions on justice and universal rights with the speech and actions of people motivated by racist hatred is not only wrong but dangerous. To do so because the interests of a foreign nation communicated by politically motivated lobby groups coincide with a desire by the state to clamp down on the democratic rights of people in our own country is cynical in the extreme. All the while, more than a year after the National Anti-Racism Framework was handed down, this government has still not provided a formal response to getting rid of racism in this country at a national level. You haven't even responded to the work of the Race Discrimination Commissioner. You say you want to fix the problem in this country, and believe me, hate arrived on these shores over 200 years ago, and my people have been subjected to hate all of that time. You haven't provided anything back to the Anti-Discrimination Commissioner, let alone committed to implementing any part of it, which says that everyone should do racism training in this place. We know that we've got racists in this place that inform the legislation. Instead, we are presented with rushed legislation, done a deal with the Libs, the coalition on the hate crimes, done a deal with the Greens on the guns. So the crossbench have no say in any of it. Deal done. Late night meetings and conversations and backroom discussions. So it's stitched up. And as a member of the Human Rights Committee that is meant to scrutinise legislation,
That's right.
it didn't even come to us. So you haven't even followed your own colonial procedures here, which you tell me to do all the time, don't they? So you didn't even follow proper process. So anyway, here we are, rushed legislation that's very dangerous to everyday people out there, that dangerously expands state power, is riddled with legislative inconsistencies, and undermines fundamental principles of the rule of law and due process. We don't have a human rights bill in this country either, so human rights in this country is not protected. People's human rights. Despite removal of the racial vilification offence, the bill as a whole continues to pose a risk of discriminatory enforcement and disproportionate impact on Muslim people, Palestinians, First Peoples, and other racialised or marginalised people. For example, it grants sweeping new authority to the Minister for Home Affairs to cancel or refuse visas with minimal safeguards. So the Minister can just say, yep, yeah, we heard what that one's been saying, cancel his visa, forget about the family, children, connection here, he can go. This is a government with a long record of cruelty towards migrants and refugees, now using the language of anti-racism to further undermine fairness, due process and accountability in our immigration system. This bill also treats religious instruction as a risk factor, lending legitimacy to Islamophobic public, political and media narratives that justify heightened scrutiny and over-policing of Muslim communities. I see here the same White Australia policy that criminalised, killed and punished my people for practising culture, for gathering and for speaking our languages. If this Parliament truly wants to confront hate, it must do so by addressing racism as a whole. This is a racist country. Australia is a racist country. No doubt about it. But we're not addressing that, are we here? If this Parliament wants to confront hate, it must do so by addressing the racism, protecting all communities and defending democratic rights, including the right to protest and speak freely. Protest is important. Protest is part of democracy. Peaceful protest. We've got nothing by standing silent and idle, waiting for who? The government to do it? We have to protect protest. Anything less is not justice. It is shallow politics dressed up as protection. And as Chelsea Watego says, it's another day in the colony.
Senator Thorpe, just to assist the chamber before I give the call to you, Senator McDonald, we already have a second reading amendment before the chair, so your amendment that you wish to make will need to be foreshadowed now and moved later on in the debate.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator McDonald.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. Well, this legislation is bad.
Hear, hear.
It's rushed. There was no consultation with affected Australians. 1 million constituents. 1 million Australians who didn't get a say.
That's right.
And there was definitely none done with firearm-related researchers and with academics who are saying this legislation will not work. It will not achieve the outcome of reducing illegal firearms. This is instead a very expensive stunt to distract from the Prime Minister being forced kicking and screaming to a royal commission and to respond to the tragedy of the Bondi massacre. What an outrageous and discriminatory and dumb statement to say that there are too many guns in Australia. This demonstrates the anti-gun agenda of Labor and the Greens. Their lack of understanding of different sorts of firearms. Apparently, all guns are the same. Senator Mackenzie gave us some great examples of why you have a need for different firearms as well as for different golf clubs. Their lack of understanding of why Australians need and enjoy firearms. Worse, this is a government who seeks to deny Australians a very basic right to choose what firearms they own for their enjoyment. Of course, there are more guns in Australia. There are 9 million more Australians than Port Arthur. Australians who enjoy competitive shooting, clay target shooting, hunting, and many Australians who use guns for work, such as farmers, graziers and pest contractors. But be clear, there are fewer guns proportionally now than after Port Arthur. Less. Australia has some of the strongest firearm laws in the world. They are strict and they have been shown to work. But this bill before us today does not build on what works. It risks punishing the wrong people for the wrong reasons. There was no input from legal experts, from criminologists. Their subsequent submissions that have been sent to me show that the rate of firearm-related crime is less. Crimes with knives and cars and fists and hands, that's increasing. Perhaps the next time the government will introduce legislation that would limit the number and type of knives that could be owned by Australians. Well, of course not. That would be ridiculous. But not much more ridiculous than this massive overreach. The Australian Institute for Criminology has data that demonstrates these laws won't work. They are simply an attack on everyday Australians who enjoy guns. 1 million Australians. Maybe it's not the sport that you enjoy, but that does not make it wrong. Let us be clear about the rushed nature of this legislation. The legislation that would have prevented the importation of clothing and equipment used by competitive shooters and clay shooters. Senator Mackenzie's talked about it. Olympic vests. That had to be changed once the member for Hunter pointed out how ridiculous that was. What about those Australians who reload their ammunition?
That's right.
Sometimes it's for cost. That's what my father did in drought years. That's what Australians do who want to be really accurate with the sort of missile and the powder that they use. That's the fun of being an expert at something. That's the joy of competition. But we won't have that in Australia. This bill also allows us the use of AI to assist with decision-making on intelligence findings. Contravenes a recommendation of the Robo-Debt Royal Commission, but it's in the legislation. So let us be clear about who lawful firearm owners are in this country. At the last count, and this is a couple of years ago, there are 943,000 licensed firearm holders nationwide, including farmers, professional pest controllers, sporting shooters and collectors. Forget the stereotypes. Lawful gun owners aren't hillbillies blasting away. They are white-collar professionals, tradies, police officers, veterans, military personnel, who take the responsibility of gun ownership, and I would like to add senators to that list, who take the responsibility of gun ownership very seriously. They are also the people who volunteer for the SES. They help at community groups. They're mums and dads and grandmas and grandpas. There are more than 4 million registered firearms, each tracked, regulated and subject to strict licensing conditions. In Queensland alone, there are over 224,000 licensed owners. For the Queensland senators in here, the people we come to represent. In New South Wales, there are more than 252,000, Senator Cadell. In Victoria, Senator Mackenzie will know this, 236,000 Australians who are licensed for guns. These Australians are not criminals, they're not extremists, and they are not responsible for terrorism or hate-motivated violence.
Right.
They go through stringent police checks and they will tell you the hoops that they are required to jump through to purchase, to store and to use firearms. Yet under this bill, they're just collateral damage in what amounts to a policy response driven by fear and not fact. Australians who we should be here to represent and defend and protect. And at last week's parliamentary hearings, the department made some absolutely extraordinary admissions. When asked whether it had conducted any research into gun buyback schemes overseas, The answer was no. When asked if it had modelled whether this bill would reduce gun crime, the answer was no. When asked if the buyback scheme would reduce the number of illegal firearms in Australia, the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission said it was highly unlikely. Highly unlikely. That matters because Australia has an estimated 260,000 illegal firearms circulating in the criminal black market being used by organised crime groups and illicit drug barons. But this bill does nothing to address that. It will not stop gunland shootings. It will not stop criminal trafficking networks and standover men. Perhaps the government could turn its mind to that rather than undermining ordinary, law-abiding Australians. It will not prevent terrorists from accessing illegal weapons. Instead, it targets firearms that are already licensed, registered and securely stored. Expert evidence tells us this approach is fundamentally flawed. Dr. Samara McPhedran, an internationally recognised firearms violence researcher and former member of the Queensland Police Weapons Advisory Panel, has shown that over nearly 30 years in Australia, legal firearm ownership has increased. That's a good thing. That's a good thing. Firearm homicide and misuse have declined. There is no demonstrated relationship between levels of legal gun ownership and firearm violence. That evidence directly undermines the core premise of this bill. More legal firearms has not meant more crime. If anything, Australian data shows the opposite. Industry groups are also sounding the alarm. The Shooting Industry Foundation Australia has made it clear that legal firearm owners and businesses are not the problem. This bill lacks evidence, it lacks detail, it lacks fairness. Poorly designed buybacks can actually increase safety risks, not reduce them. Unlike the 1996 buyback, this bill provides no guarantee of fair market value, no certainty for small businesses, and shifts massive financial risk onto the states. The federal allocation of around $1 billion falls dramatically short of industry estimates, which suggest costs could exceed $15 billion. That shortfall will be pushed onto taxpayers, or worse, onto compliant businesses and volunteer-run clubs that simply cannot afford it. Clubs like the Ipswich and District Rifle Club have said plainly these reforms do not address criminal misuse or hate-motivated violence, but impose significant burdens on lawful sporting communities. Even Labor's own member for Hunter warned on Christmas Eve that when you rush things through, it has unintended consequences. And yet, here we are, rushing again. What was the urgency? Could this have not waited 2 weeks for it to be properly considered? Let me be very clear on one final point. This bill dangerously links lawful firearm ownership with anti-Semitism and terrorism. That linkage is wrong. It is unsupported by evidence, and it unfairly vilifies Australians who have done nothing wrong. I urge critics of gun ownership in this country, especially those opposite, visit your local shooting club. There you will find men and women with a total commitment to safety and the law. Cowboys aren't tolerated. Education is paramount, and there is constant reinforcement that breaking the rules is totally unacceptable. We should also bear in mind that those who own businesses supplying lawful firearms, accessories, spare parts, ammunition and hunting gear. The lawful firearms and shooting sector represents a multi-billion-dollar, highly regulated industry, contributing between $2.8 billion and over $3.5 billion annually to the Australian economy and supporting tens of thousands of jobs many in regional Australia. Terrorism is driven by ideology, not sporting rifles locked in safes. If the government is serious about community safety, the evidence is clear about what works. Targeted policing, disrupting trafficking networks, including at our international borders, seizing illegal firearms, investing in intelligence and counter-extremism capabilities. That is where resources should go, not into a poorly designed buyback that won't reduce the number of illegal guns. This bill should be amended, paused for proper consultation, rejected, anything but rushed through and passed today. Because legal, lawful firearm owners are not the problem. Criminals are.
That's right.
Terrorists are. And our laws should focus squarely on them. These laws are a sellout on law-abiding Australians under an unholy alliance between Labor and the Greens. They are not supported by science, they are not supported by data, and they are not supported by ordinary Australians who just want to live their lives. I urge you to reject this legislation, as I will.
Hear, hear.
Thank you. Senator Cox.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. Today I speak in support of the Combating Anti-Semitism, Hate and Extremism, Firearms and Customs Law Bill 2026. And I do so not only as a senator, but someone who's lived through what major firearms reform looks like when it moves from this place into practice. I was a police officer during the last gun buyback scheme that followed Port Arthur nearly 30 years ago. And for those who remember that period only through the headlines, it's worth recalling what that meant on the ground. During the buyback, police officers, just like me, worked at front counters, which are normally known as non-operational spots. But we were handling surrendered firearms every day. And we did not always know whether those firearms and weapons were loaded. We also didn't know how they had been stored. We didn't always know the emotional state of the person standing on the other side of the counter, whether they were angry, whether they were distressed, whether they were unwell, or simply having the worst day of their life. That is what police did do back in those days. We wore our tactical accoutrements during that period, and not to escalate situations, but because the risk demanded it. It is a good reminder that gun laws are not theoretical to first responders. They are lived. They are lived by police, by paramedics, by emergency services workers, in police station front counters, in rural sheds, in roadside stops, and in people's homes. And when those laws are fragmented, outdated, or incomplete, it is police and the paramedics who absorb the risk first. Australia learned a hard lesson at Port Arthur, and the response was decisive, it was national, and it was, in fact, bipartisan. It worked. Firearm deaths fell, mass shootings stopped, and lives were saved. But nearly 3 decades on, we are no longer in the same conditions or facing the same level of risk. There are now more than 4 million firearms in circulation across Australia, more than at the time of Port Arthur, which held under close to 1 million licences. In several states, the number of registered firearms alone exceeds 1 million. This is not an argument about responsible ownership. It is about scale and it is about saturation. And it is about what happens when the scale collides with moments of crisis. Because as firearms numbers rise, so does the likelihood that weapons are lost, stolen, poorly secured, or accessed by people that they were never intended for. And for police and paramedics, again, those risks do not stay theoretical. They show up in call-outs every single day, in split-second decisions and in situations where the errors had permanent consequences. And my good friend and colleague, Senator Mulholland, already has articulated that in her home state of Queensland. Firearms rarely stay confined to their original context forever. They in fact move between households, between relationships, and sometimes into those moments of crisis. And it is also critical that we're honest about the relationship of firearms and family and domestic violence. Domestic violence call-outs are among some of the most unpredictable and dangerous situations first responders attend. They are emotionally charged, fast-moving, and often unfold behind closed doors. But when a firearm is present, or even suspected to be present, the risk to victims, responding officers, and children in the home escalates immediately. Presence of a gun changes the dynamic entirely. It compresses time, limits safe options, and removes those margins for error. This is not an abstract concern. It is the reality that first responders confront repeatedly. In 2023, in Floreat, in my home state of Western Australia, Jennifer Pachulik and her daughter Gretel were murdered by a man with a history of family and domestic violence, looking for his former partner and his own daughter before he took his own life. Subsequent reviews identified clear warning signs in the period leading up to those deaths about his escalating behaviour, feared expression by those close to him, and the ongoing access to firearms. As the number of firearms in circulation grows, so does the chance that weapons remain accessible despite signs like this. Again, they may be poorly secured or drawn into moments of coercion, instability, or loss of control. Jennifer and Gretel's case is not an anomaly. It is a pattern encountered again and again by police and paramedics across this country. This is why firearms reform must be understood as domestic violence prevention measure, not merely as a matter of crime control. Reducing overall firearm numbers, strengthening licensing decisions, and ensuring intelligence is considered when risk emerges are interventions that prevent harm before it becomes fatal. Gun laws are not only about what happens behind closed doors. They are about how risk escalates when hatred, grievance, and instability are combined with access to weapons, whether that violence occurs in a home or in a public space. The Bondi Beach terrorist attack on 14th of December 2025 was the most devastating expression of that risk. 15 innocent people lost their lives in an attack motivated by anti-Semitism and carried out in a place meant for community, celebration, and belonging. In response, we are right to say we must deal with both the motivation and the method. That is the why and that is the how. This bill does exactly that. It recognises that firearms policy must be fit for purpose in a changing risk environment, one shaped not only by volume but also by technology. We now live in a world where weapons do not always arrive in a crate. Sometimes they arrive as a download. Digital blueprints for firearms and explosives can now be accessed online. Components can be ordered separately. Firearms or critical parts of them can be manufactured using 3D printers outside regulatory oversight. First responders and investigators, this represents a profound shift in the risk. An unregistered, unserialised and untraceable firearm does not just breach the law, it defeats prevention, frustrates investigation and enables repeated harm. And that is the reality this bill responds to. It addresses not only the physical imports, but the digital pathways to violence. It introduces targeted offences related to the use of carriage services to access and possess material that facilitates the illicit manufacture of firearms and explosives. These offences are carefully framed and proportionate, with clear pathways for licensed manufacturers, law enforcement, public officials, and legitimate academic and scientific research. This is not about criminalising lawful activity. It is about interrupting a pathway to harm that is already being exploited. The same preventative logic that applies at the border. Our borders are often the last opportunity to stop high-risk firearms, parts and accessories before they enter our communities. And when those controls fail, the consequences are not borne by systems, they are borne by people. That is why this bill tightens controls on rapid-fire weapons, high-capacity magazines, belt-fed firearms, unserialised components, and sound suppressors. It removes open-ended import permits that allow bulk imports with minimal oversight, and it introduces a clear public safety test so that the items posing and unacceptable risk can be stopped before they actually enter into circulation. This bill also establishes the legislative framework for a national gun buyback, building on the approach that was taken after Port Arthur. This is not unprecedented or ideological. It is a proven public policy, one for which Australia has been praised for internationally. And by compensating a voluntary surrender of surplus, newly restricted and illegal firearms, the buyback supports state and territory reforms and reduces overall exposure to harm. Fewer guns mean fewer opportunities for diversion, misuse and escalation. Finally, this legislation strengthens the way firearm licensing decisions are informed. It allows security and criminal intelligence to be considered while also preserving state and territory decision-making authority. As someone who has been a police officer, I can say this plainly. A clean criminal record does not always equate to low risk. Intelligence exists to identify emerging threats, and ignoring it does not protect civil liberties. It endangers lives. This bill is not about punishing lawful firearms owners. It is explicitly protecting legitimate occupational and sporting use for farmers, pest controllers, professional shooters and competitors. But access to firearms is not a right. It is actually a responsibility, one that must be assessed in light of public safety, changing technology and also lived experience. But when a firearm laws fail, it's not the politicians who face the consequences first. It is the police responding to the calls, the paramedics treating the injured, and the emergency workers managing the aftermath. It is the families and the communities living with the irreversible loss. It is all Australians right now mourning the 15 lives taken at Bondi. People in this place have made the hard choices before when the stakes were high, and now it's time for us here in this place to do it again.
Senator Shoebridge.
Thanks very much, Acting Deputy. Just over a month ago, two hateful, violent men killed and shot 15 people in an appalling anti-Semitic attack at Bondi Beach, just a few miles from my home, in fact. That appalling attack happened with guns that were obtained legally. Indeed, those two hateful men between them had access to 6 firearms, legally obtained and signed off under our national firearms laws. We need to stop and reflect on that. And those who are opposing this legislation should stop and reflect on that fact. The appalling fact that our gun laws have failed in this instance needs to be part of a national response to this appalling anti-Semitic attack in Bondi. And the Greens are glad that we've been able to work with the government to ensure that legislation that will establish a national firearms buyback, legislation that will ensure that security agencies, police around this country will be able to share in real time the security information they have about individuals before they're given a gun licence and before they're given guns will become lawful and essential and necessary after this legislation passed. And we're also proud to be supporting legislation that stops some of the most dangerous weapons being imported into this country and available for acts of violence. But we won't be supporting, and we've made it clear to the government, we will not be supporting their raft of other proposed changes to ban people and organisations whose core values are about supporting human rights and opposing genocide, to target groups who have been saying clearly that our government should do all it can to stop a genocide in Gaza. And we know that there are millions of Australians right now deeply anxious that not this legislation, but the legislation that will follow it, about prescribing organisations, about putting people in jail for their thoughts, that legislation, far from making them safe, is threatening them, their friends, their families and their communities for the crime, in the eyes of the Labor Party and the Coalition, of opposing a genocide and standing up for global human rights. But I want to return to this legislation. This is legislation to support the national firearms buyback, to allow that information.
The situation is dramatically worse.
To stop some of the most dangerous weapons.
What we're finding is a confluence of factors.
I want to start by thanking the Australian
North.
Gun Safety Alliance, the Alana and Madeline Foundation, Gun Control Australia, the Public Health Association of Australia for their advice and collaboration, because this legislation, unlike the other legislation being rushed through this parliament, this legislation has been a long time coming. And it's been the subject of detailed submissions, repeated calls from civil society to say, ensure that our national firearms laws are meeting the moment. National gun buybacks are not novel. They've happened before. They have taken weapons out of homes that should never have been in homes. They've reduced the number of firearms in this country. They have saved countless lives. And as a Greens senator, I feel sure that this national firearms buyback will also save countless lives. But the advice of those community organisations has been consistent, it's been principled, and it's been focused on gun safety. Unlike the Coalition, the Greens aren't taking advice from firearms manufacturers like Beretta. We're not taking donations from firearms importers and sellers like Nyoa. We don't follow the lead of the global arms industry like the Coalition does. And we definitely don't import toxic concepts from the United States, Trumpian US concepts like the right to bear arms when we're talking about firearms. Firearms are not a right in this country. They are a privilege. And when we have the Coalition come in here and try and equate firearms laws with vehicle safety or guns with motor vehicles, it shows how they have so lost touch. And they don't understand that unlike motor vehicles, guns' purpose is to kill. Guns' purpose is to kill. And if the Coalition can't understand that, if they can't understand that basic principle, if they're not troubled by the fact that those two hateful men on Bondi Beach had access to legal firearms, more than 6 legal firearms, if they're not troubled by that, if they're not troubled by the fact that when New South Wales Police gave the firearms licence and gave the firearms to one of those men, that they didn't have access to the security information from the AFP and they didn't have access to security information from other police. And because of that, and it wasn't shared in real time, that these two hateful men had access to firearms, if the Coalition isn't troubled by that, they should review their conscience. And they most definitely should review their politics. Because the Greens are deeply concerned by those gaps in our firearms laws. And we've been concerned about gaps like that for well over a decade. I also want to note the extensive work by the Australia Institute on tracking the number of firearms in this country and checking and looking at the gun control settings that have allowed the rapid growth of lethal weapons in our community. And I want to also thank my team, my Chief of Staff and others, who have for years now been tracking gun numbers in New South Wales. We have seen a disturbing rise of firearms in this country since Port Arthur. And can I say that as a state MP and now as a senator, we have continued to press for data, initially from New South Wales, but now nationally, about the number of guns in this country. And appallingly, only New South Wales provides that data. And can I say, only New South Wales provides that data because my office, over a number of years, took them to court to produce that data so that we could see the number of guns in suburbs and so that people had a sense of whether or not they were living near private arsenals. And what that data that is now found in our toomanyguns.org website shows, it shows that as at 2016, when we first began getting that data, there were 850,000 registered firearms in New South Wales. But the data that's now been released as of June of 2025, showed that there are over 1,026,000 registered firearms in New South Wales, and that doesn't include collectors or dealers. There are private arsenals in our suburbs where people hold almost 300 firearms. Multiple individuals in suburban Sydney who hold over 200 firearms, and dozens who hold over 100 firearms. Why do our firearms laws allow private arsenals to be held in our suburban centres in this country? And thankfully, after pressure from the Greens, pressure from the gun safety advocates, some of those loopholes have been closed in New South Wales. But the Coalition is still fighting this in Queensland, still pushing that they don't get adopted in South Australia, and still basically silent in Tasmania, while the Northern Territory Coalition has said that they don't support caps on firearms. This is about community safety, and the Coalition comes in here armed with donations from the firearms industry, and they oppose community safety laws, and they make specious arguments about needing dozens of weapons to shoot wallabies, or the most extreme case relating to somebody who wants to compete in every single shooting sport in the Olympics, and that's why these gun caps don't work. Take a reality check about what's going to make our communities safe. And a gun buyback and sensible gun limits in our suburbs, in our cities, definitely take a step towards safety. So I want to acknowledge that this is a moment where we can take practical steps to take guns away from people who should never get them, to allow for the sharing of real-time security information so that where police in one state, or the AFP, has information about people who are taking part in hateful ideologies, that can be shared with police in real time before they get gun licences and firearms. And I say again, how is it that One Nation and the Coalition oppose those law changes? How is it you could oppose the sharing in real time between our security agencies of information about whether people are engaged in hateful extremist ideologies so we can ensure they don't get a firearm? Because we've seen the effect of it in Bondi. And all the politics, all the hateful language directed against the Greens in this debate. Take a moment and reflect on the Coalition opposing those law changes here. It shows their politics. And it shows that they take funds from the firearms industry. And it shows that they'll never partner with the community about gun safety laws. And what a change from 1996, where the Coalition actually had some backbone and actually did good work. I am no friend of John Howard, but I will acknowledge at that point the Coalition showed the leadership that's been missing in the last 4 weeks on this. I do note that there are concerns raised by groups including the National Farmers Federation, that there are questions still to be answered about the gun buyback. And we want to ensure, and we'd like a commitment from the government, that fair value will be paid to ensure that the guns buyback will be as effective as it possibly can and take as many guns that shouldn't be in circulation out of circulation as we can. And we'd ask the government to make that commitment in the course of this debate. But I also want to credit the Gun Safety Alliance with pressing for another essential reform. One of the reasons we're in this mess is there's no body, no organisation in this country whose job it is to future-proof our firearms laws, to see whether or not there are gaps that need to be fixed. There's plenty of lobbying from the firearms industry trying to put new gaps in our laws, but there's no way in this country that sits together with the national government, state and federal governments, to plug the holes and trek for community safety. So I am glad that in the course of these negotiations, the Greens have secured a clear commitment from the government, in writing from the Home Affairs Minister, to establish a National Firearms Safety Council that will do that work, bring together those gun safety advocates from the Gun Safety Alliance, community representatives, and ensure that we're regularly reporting to Parliament to make our national gun laws not just safe for the 19th of January 2026, but future-proof them going forward. Can I also raise concerns that I think are valid about the potential proliferation of 3D printed weapons? And I want to thank the Minister for Home Affairs' office for their engagement around some of the firearms offences that deal with the issue of 3D printing. I note that these federal laws will allow some 3D alteration printing to firearms as long as they comply with the licence and class of weapon that's been obtained. These are areas of hard regulation. And the National Firearms Register and all any national laws need to ensure that there is immediate, constant reference back and communication back to the state registries and territory registries about any such alteration. And this Parliament and the National Firearms Safety Council needs to keep a close and continued surveillance on 3D printed weapons. But can I finish with this? Two hateful men with a hateful ideology are dangerous and need to be addressed by our parliaments, need to be addressed by all of us collectively if we can. But two hateful men with access to multiple firearms, and if they've got access legally to multiple firearms, we have an obligation to act. The Greens are proud to always support the community and gun safety. We're proud to talk down and oppose those whose primary interest comes from the firearms lobby. And we're proud to support legislation in what is otherwise a toxic mess of a week in this Parliament that will take those important steps for gun safety across the country.
Senator McGrath.
Thank you. As a Liberal National Party Senator for Queensland, I know these gun laws are bad laws and I won't support them. These gun laws punish millions of Australians. These gun laws punish millions of innocent law-abiding Australians. These bad laws are punishing millions of law-abiding Australians who use guns for work, for recreation, for sport, or they just like to collect guns. We know that Labor are traditionally soft on crime, but today we learn that Labor are hard on law-abiding Australians. Because the real dangerous weapons are anti-Semitism and radical Islamic extremism. Islamic extremists have used knives, they've used cars, trucks, bikes, planes, but Labor didn't call for bans then, did they? These gun laws are a classic but sad overreach by a left-wing government who will punish innocent Australians as a diversion from their own failures to deal with anti-Semitism. Because remember, the Bondi massacre did not start at 6:42 p.m. on Sunday the 14th of December. The Bondi massacre started on the steps of the Sydney Opera House, where an ugly mob of Islamic extremists gathered and shouted, "F the Jews, gas the Jews, where's the Jews?" And what did this Labor government do about Islamic extremism and the rising tide of anti-Semitism? Nothing. Because over the past 2 years, Jewish Australians have suffered a cancerous tsunami of anti-Semitism. Jewish schools have to have high fences and security guards. Jewish school students hide their school uniforms when on public transport. Universities have become madrasas of hatred. Synagogues are firebombed, businesses are boycotted, artists are cancelled, homes and cars are attacked. And even last night, young Jewish Australians were abused on the streets of Melbourne. We wonder how this has come about. When people shout out from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, people in this chamber have said that phrase. And we wonder how and why Bondi happened when anti-Semites, including those in this chamber, have given a green light to such conduct and such behaviour. So the Prime Minister won't say sorry to Jewish Australians. He won't say sorry to Australians for failing in his number one duty to keep Australians safe. But he will punish millions of innocent law-abiding gun owners as a diversion. So to all the Queensland gun owners, gun clubs, shooters, whether for recreation, sport, safety, you like to collect guns, the LNP is standing up for you. So thank you for reaching out. I especially want to mention Matt Crossley and Laurie Choate for your counsel and your advice. My colleagues in this chamber will move a series of amendments to try and improve these bad laws, but because of the dirty deal between Labor and the Greens, the amendments won't get up, so a bad law will pass. And sadly, debate will be guillotined because of the said dirty deal. We will vote against this bill because this bill punishes innocent Australians when in fact what the government should be doing is going after radical Islam.
Senator Roberts.
Thank you. Part of the Bondi massacre horror was the realisation that the great Australian she'll be right mate has failed us. We've watched the growing pro-Gaza demonstrations openly calling for violence against Jews and anyone who supports them. We've watched Islamic clerics preach hate against Western civilization and their calls for jihad, violence against unbelievers. And many Australians thought, she'll be right, mate. This is Australia. This will sort itself out. It did not. For many years, the left-wing commentariat, politicians and media, accused those who sought to raise the alarms around rising anti-Semitism and Christian phobia with the crime of threatening social harmony. The very elastic crime of racism has now been extended to describe as racist anyone who defends Australia and our way of life. Many Australians have been guilty of shooting the messenger, while the message itself, the hatred and radicalisation, went unchallenged. We were told that highlighting radicalisation was the problem, rather than the radicalisation itself. Well, now look. Australia will not be a safe and tolerant society again until the evil encouraged to fester in our beautiful country is cast out. An evil that's become an ecosystem of poison, as Labor's Mike Kelly so aptly recently described. The Bondi massacre was not Islamic on Jewish terror imported from the other side of the world. The gunman did not stop to ask if the victims were Jewish before executing them. We must call Bondi what it is, a radical Islamist attack on all Australians. Why were the Labor Party, the Greens, the Teals and the globalist Liberals so blind to the growing threat of Islamic terror in this country? As recently as the 16th of May 2023, Prime Minister Albanese denied the reality of Islamic terrorism when he said, quote, "The strongest threat to our security identified has been right-wing extremism." This statement from the Prime Minister and Quisling bureaucrats is misdirection. Fascists and white supremacists are a straw man argument. Their numbers are tiny and their influence non-existent. Yet the Prime Minister knowingly and deliberately uses them to divert Australians' attention away from radical Islam. The Greens are advocating extension to the hate crimes legislation to cover hate against LGBTQ+, transgenders and anyone else who does not worship the religion of the sky god of warming. Okay, I threw in the climate. Yet once censorship laws such as those the Prime Minister is pushing are introduced, the inevitable outcome is to deplatform political opponents. The Greens' call to extend the hate crimes provisions are designed to confuse the issue, to create multiple moving targets, and to allow the government to pretend it's doing something without ever taking action against the real problem, Islamic terror. One only has to look at the history of Islamic terror attacks against Western civilization to see strong measures are needed now. Munich Olympics massacre, 1972, 12 dead. Bali bombings, 2002, 202 dead, including 88 Australians. Second Bali bombings, 2005, 20 dead, including 4 Australians. London bombings, 2005, 52 dead. Charlie Hebdo shooting, Paris, 2015, 12 dead. Brussels airport bombings, 2016, 32 dead. Nice truck ramming, 2016, 86 dead, and no calls for a truck buyback. Berlin Christmas market truck ramming, 2016, 12 dead, no truck buyback. Pulse gay nightclub attack, Orlando, 2016, 49 dead. Manchester arena bombing, 2017, 22 dead. Hamas attack in Israel, October 7, 2023, 1,180 dead. Moscow Crocus City Hall bombing and stabbing attack, 2024, 145 dead in Russia. And now Bondi, which was not the first Islamic terrorist attack in Australia. Lind Cafe siege, Sydney, 2014, 2 dead. Melbourne Burke Street car ramming, 2017, 6 dead, no car buyback. Bishop Mario Emanuel stabbing, 2024. Islamic terror is here, right here on Australian soil, and it's been here for 25 years. All these terrorist attacks were predicated on a hatred of Western civilization and a fundamental belief that Islam will rule the world and non-believers will convert or die. ASIO can't warn against what it can't see. ASIO's budget is now over $1 billion a year, double what it was 5 years ago, and it's not enough. Australia must decide, do we further increase ASIO funding or do we start sending people home who have demonstrated hatred for Australians? At ASIO, there are 230 potential terrorists being monitored participating in de-radicalisation therapy at taxpayers' expense. Here's One Nation's de-radicalisation therapy. Boarding passes, immediate deportation, remigration, never to return. While ASIO were busy mollycoddling violent extremists, they missed the Bondi shooters travelling to a known Philippines terrorist training ground for an extended stay before returning and committing their terror. ASIO missed that the father of a suspected terrorist purchased 3 guns on the same Thursday night in September 2023 from the same New South Wales firearms dealer. ASIO missed that hate preacher Wasim Haddad holds a current New South Wales firearms licence. Haddad led Sydney's Al Medina Doa Centre, where one of the Bondi shooters, Naveed Akram, studied. Akram's father had a gun licence for 6 guns in New South Wales. How did none of this trip a red flag at the New South Wales Police, the Home Affairs or ASIO? A royal commission must determine if this was willful ignorance to protect a demographic that's much more likely to vote Labor than Conservative. Australia is not the country it was when I was growing up. The destruction of social harmony started when successive governments let in people who came to live apart from us, not assimilate with us. Those who betray the hospitality we've shown them must be required to leave. Those who wage war crimes against Australians should be charged. As an example, ISIS brides travelled overseas to conduct war against Australia and against our armed forces. ISIS bride Zira Duman spoke on social media in 2015 and demanded that the faithful, quote, attack the UK, Australia and the United States, kill them, stab them, poison their food, your food. This is who Minister Burke knowingly and secretly enabled and helped to be smuggled back into our country. They perpetrated criminal activities and should be prosecuted instead of making work for ASIO following them around. Under our Westminster system of government, the buck for these failures stops with Prime Minister Albanese and Premier Minns. The terms of reference for the Royal Commission, if we ever see them, must allow scrutiny of how these failures occurred. This is no doubt why the Prime Minister refused for so long to call a Royal Commission, to protect himself and his ministers, to hide the truth. Today, the Senate is voting on legislation which could have been brought in a regular sitting later in the year. What we are not voting on is the enabling legislation for the Royal Commission, to first get the data and the facts. This is what Royal Commissions are for, to inform bills like this. The Albanese government is putting the cart before the horse, burying the facts. Prime Minister, Australia is watching this Royal Commission. Do not cover up anything. If the cards are not allowed to fall as they may, then it will be your government that will fall. One Nation will oppose this rushed dog's breakfast bill and the second bill coming after it later tonight. There are processes to produce good legislation. This government has made a mockery of them all. The atrocious, shoddy legislation reflects contempt for our democratic process, for the people of Australia. The hate provisions of the Commonwealth Criminal Code Labor introduced in 2010 and subsequently amended to make prosecutions easier have never been used, not one prosecution. Australia does not need more laws which take away the right to free speech, freedom of association, freedom of movement and freedom of protest. We need the government to start policing the laws we already have. Whether people are Christian or another civilised religion, there can only be one set of laws, and those are laws based on our Christian Western heritage. There can be only one allegiance in our community, and it's to those laws. Tolerance has been weaponised. Labor, Greens, Teals, and now the Liberals have elevated tolerance to be the end itself. The thing being tolerated became irrelevant. Speaking about Islam has been made prima facie criticism. Yet speaking about Islam has been made prima facie racism. Yet criticism of Christianity and Judaism is encouraged as being the religions of white-skinned people, of colonisers. White-skinned people are being demonised from the left-wing lobby, from other white-skinned people, like Green Senator McKim, who said yesterday that Australians will not be safe until we've eliminated Islamophobia. In Greensland, apparently there's no radical Islam. The terrorist attacks I listed earlier never happened. It's this illogical, suicidal empathy that's led us to this moment. The list of terror attacks I read used guns, bombs, knives, cars, trucks. Guns are a straw man argument. Look over here at these evil guns and don't look at the person wielding the gun. Failing to act against radical Islam will lead to more Australians losing their lives. Australia does not have a gun problem. We have a radical ideology problem. One Nation strongly supports the right to own and use firearms lawfully and responsibly. This Combating Anti-Semitism, Hate and Extremism, Firearm and Customs Laws Bill 2026 penalises legitimate, law-abiding gun owners. The poor wording fails to understand how guns are used on farms and in sport. This is what happens when city-based anti-gun groups are consulted and gun owner associations are not. The bill proposes to limit the use of carriage services. This is pitched to limit the use of the internet to access blueprints and use 3D printers to print guns. This is already illegal under state law. This bill elevates the description of illegal material to mean whatever the hell the government decides is illegal. It could include a legal owner downloading the manual for their gun, or educational YouTube videos on how to pull down, clean and reassemble a gun, or on the science of a gun, like how the striking pin works, and how to detect chain damage or wear to machine parts which may render the gun unsafe. Merits review of a refusal to grant a gun licence under this bill is eliminated. Appeals would now have to be undertaken through the federal court, so that's, $20,000 minimum? The Administrative Review Tribunal system is working just fine. So now the government is fixing a problem that doesn't exist so it can use a spurious argument to take guns off anyone they dislike. As Minister Watt raises on gun numbers, let me assist him. There are more guns in Australia now than 1996, before the Port Arthur buyback, because our population has increased. The number of guns per person today is less than in 1996. Less. And the number of gun owners per person is less. Honesty is important, Senator Watt. One Nation supports the right of Australians to participate in sports involving firearms, to use firearms for hunting or recreational shooting, to collect antique and historically significant firearms, and to use firearms in rural areas for pest and stock management. One Nation seeks to end discrimination against legitimate firearm owners and users, ensure all stakeholders are fairly consulted in the development of firearms laws and regulations, and make existing laws fairer. And we seek to improve community safety. Community safety. Cracking down on illegal firearm use with stronger penalties if firearms are used in committing crimes. The buyback scheme is a blank cheque, which industry sources we spoke with said could cost up to $15 billion. This is a tax on everyday Australians because it must be paid for with a tax. One Nation supports castle law, the right to use force, fatal force if necessary, and proportionate to defend one's home and family from an intruder. Bring that legislation before Parliament and One Nation will support it. The Combating Anti-Semitism, Hate and Extremism Criminal Migration Laws Bill 2026 has been so badly rushed that critical passages are inconsistent to the point that a court is likely to refuse prosecution based on these inconsistent provisions. The changes on which the government and Liberal leader Susan Lee surrendered do not justify Liberals supporting this bill. The government said that creating a new offence of racial vilification was removed from the hastily redrafted bill. Yet some elements are hidden in the revised bill. The bill still includes supremacy. Anyone who says Australian society is superior to Islamic society is off to jail for 5 years, 12 if you're a priest or a lay preacher. Will the government start rounding up hate preachers in the electorates of senior Labor ministers like Messrs Burke, Butler and Bowen for declaring the superiority of Islam over Christianity? Of course not. Make no mistake, this bill continues the war on Christianity and the promotion of Islam that's been a feature of left-wing politics for a generation. I welcome the last-minute government amendment to include a clause attempting to guarantee freedom of political communication, even if that protection is already in the Constitution. It may make it less likely this bill will be used to ban political rivals, including One Nation. The bill still does not mention anti-Semitism, not once. It was never about protecting Jews. It was always about promoting Islam over Christianity. Liberal leader Susan Lee has sided with the Labor Party to wave it through without due process, with onerous clauses that take away people's freedoms, that will cost all Australians more in taxes, and that will in the end fundamentally change the nature of Australian society without protecting and recurrence. Australians, your choice is now One Nation or no nation.
Senator Blythe.
Thank you very much, Acting Deputy Chair. Now, this bill is a case study, I think, for this Parliament on how not to legislate. Labor has taken a national tragedy and responded not with calm, precision or competence, but with a rushed, poorly targeted and deeply flawed piece of legislation. It has been pushed through this Parliament with inadequate scrutiny, truncated consultation and a take-it-or-leave-it attitude that shows contempt for proper lawmaking. Australians deserve better than policy made on the run. And let me be clear about one fundamental point that this bill deliberately obscures. Australia does not have a gun problem. What we have is a radical Islamist extremism problem, and this government has consistently failed to confront it honestly and directly. Every major terrorist attack on Australian soil in the past 2 decades has been driven by radical Islamist ideology. That is the uncomfortable truth the government refuses to name. Instead of tackling that ideology, dismantling the networks that promote it, and stamping out the anti-Semitism it fuels, Labor has chosen an easier political target: lawful Australian gun owners. Farmers, sporting shooters, collectors, dealers, and licensed competitors are being treated as collateral damage for the government's failure to act decisively against anti-Semitism and extremism when it mattered. This is unjust and it's dishonest. This bill uses the horror of the Bondi attack to justify sweeping firearms changes that would have done absolutely nothing to prevent that atrocity. Nothing in this legislation would have stopped the attack. Nothing in it addresses the radicalisation pathways that led to it. Nothing in it confronts the ideology that motivated it. Instead, it punishes people who already comply with some of the strictest gun laws in the world. Labor wants Australians to believe that confiscating more firearms, tightening imports,
and expanding bureaucratic control over lawful ownership will somehow make us safer. It will not. It simply diverts attention from the government's long-standing inaction on anti-Semitism, radicalisation and community safety. This bill has been rushed. It is poorly drafted. It was originally so unworkable that Labor was forced to split the bill in two. That alone is an admission of failure. And yet, even after that embarrassment, the government persists in trying to ram through the remainder of this bill without proper inquiry or scrutiny. It's not leadership.
The European
that's
Union
panicked.
supports Denmark
Law-abiding
and the
Australians
people of
should
Greenland,
not pay
and we
the
do
price
so
for the
united in our
government's
resolve.
refusal to confront hard truths.
The European Union
Farmers should
supports
not
Denmark
lose tools
and the people
essential
of
to their
Greenland.
livelihoods.
The measures
shooters should
threatened
not see
over the
their
weekend by
disciplines strangled.
the United States
small
administration
businesses should not be
will
driven
not help
under.
improve security in
Lawful
the
gun
Arctic.
owners should not be
In fact, they
treated
risk
as
the opposite.
suspects because the government
Greenland and
lacks the
Denmark
courage
have
to
both
deal
made
with
clear that
extremism
Greenland
at
is
its
not
source.
for sale.
Anti-Semitism must be crushed wherever it appears. Radical Islamist ideology must be confronted, named and dismantled. Terrorist networks must be disrupted. Non-citizens who promote hatred or violence should be removed from this country without hesitation.
To say this, the European Union supports Denmark and the people of Greenland, and we do so united in our resolve.
This bill does exactly that. It targets the compliant instead of the dangerous. It expands bureaucracy instead of security, and offers symbolism instead of any kind of substance. Australians are entitled to safety, but they are also entitled to honesty. And the honest assessment is this: you do not defeat terrorism by targeting farmers. You do not defeat anti-Semitism by confiscating sporting firearms. And you do not strengthen a nation by eroding trust in law-abiding citizens. For those reasons alone, this bill deserves criticism, scrutiny and resistance. And this Parliament should have the courage to say that Australia's problem is not guns, it is extremism, and the solution lies in confronting that reality, not in avoiding it. For that reason, I won't be supporting this bill.
Senator Steele-John.
Thank you very much, Acting President. On 14 December, two individuals undertook a cowardly act at Bondi Beach. Their aim was to terrorise and to murder Jewish Australians as they gathered to celebrate Hanukkah. From the moment that the first gunshot was fired, so many lives were changed forever. I won't repeat in full what I said in my condolence speech yesterday. However, I will emphasise this. Such attacks leave scars that will last generations. They leave an empty chair at the dinner table. They leave wounds on bodies and hearts. They leave moments and memories that will never be able to be made. It is a cruelty to lose those we love to acts such as this, acts that should have never taken place. We must not let the actions of these two men define entire religious, ethnic, and racial groups. As politicians, we have a responsibility to act. We must strengthen our laws so that what happened that Sunday can never happen again. It is our responsibility to counter racism and hatred in all of its forms. And in this moment of deepest grief, we must be shoulder to shoulder with one another. The Australian Greens supported the recall of Parliament. We supported the establishment of a Royal Commission to identify what went wrong and what must change. Whether in our hate speech laws, our gun laws, our intelligence agencies, we owe it to the victims, their families, and the whole community to make sure that this never happens again. And I will turn my contribution now to the need for gun law reform. We must close loopholes in our gun laws that allowed these terrorists to legally access rapid reload weapons. Many of us look at the gun violence pandemic in the United States in horror. We are rightly proud of Australia's gun law. We are rightly proud of the reforms that were enacted nearly 30 years ago in the aftermath of the Port Arthur massacre. And because gun violence is not so widespread here, some people assume that our laws must already be strong enough. The reality is that as of December 2025, there are more guns in Australia than there were before the buyback of 96. In the postcode 2026, where Bondi is located, there are 370 registered firearms. One individual has 24 registered in their name. There is no acceptable reason or justification for someone living in the inner city to own 24 firearms. None whatsoever. And that is why the Greens will support the changes in this bill. We support tighter controls on what can be imported. This bill places restrictions on the importation of assisted repeating and straight pull firearms, on magazines of more than 30 rounds of firearm suppressors and speed reloaders. We support better background checks. Moving federal firearm checks into AUSTRAC is progress. This will enable agencies and police to force and to enable the sharing of relevant information in relation to background checks. One of the clear failures in the Bondi attack was that the gunman was known to ASIO, but the information could not be used in federal firearm checks. We support a national buyback scheme, as the amount of firearms in this nation is, as I said, now higher than it was at the time of the Port Arthur massacre. We have a saturation of rapid reloading rifles and shotguns. This reality goes against the goals of the post-Port Arthur action. It is the alarm bell ringing to tell us that urgent action is now needed. But even once these changes have been made, we cannot be complacent. Firearms manufacturers have a long history of finding ways around strong gun laws. In the past, they have changed the reload mechanisms just to dodge around the restrictions. Their motivation is profit, not public safety. We need to stay vigilant to safeguard these changes. In 2023,
خطاب من به علی خامنه‌ای رهبر رژیم اشغالگر ایران است.
He took 2 legal rifles and ammunition and drove to a school car park and fired 3 shots, 2 of which hit the building. That incident showed that gun laws must evolve to stay effective. After that, Western Australia
خطاب من به علی خامنه‌ای رهبر رژیم اشغالگر ایران است. تو یک جنایتکار ضد ایرانی هستی. نه شرافت داری، نه انسانیت. دستانت به خون 10,000 ایرانی آغشته است. به خون کودکان، جوانان، بیگناهان. تو، رژیمت و تمام مزدورانت برای هر قطره خونی که ریخته اید پاسخ خواهید داد بدون استثنا. ما نه میبخشیم نه فراموش میکنیم و نه عقب مینشینیم. همان گونه که جنایتکاران نازی در نورنبرگ محاکمه و مجازات شدند، تو و همدستانت نیز محاکمه و مجازات خواهید شد در دادگاه ملت ایران. پایان تو رسوایی است، ننگ ابدی. هیچ جنایتی بی پاسخ نمیماند. نام تو ثبت شده است، نام تمام آمران، عاملان و همدستانت. راه فراری نیست، جایی برای پنهان شدن نخواهید داشت. قاتلان مردم ایران هیچ مسئولیتی نخواهند داشت. و شما ملت بزرگ ایران، فرزندان شجاع، خواهران و برادران داغدار اما استوارند. شما تنها نیستید. ایستادگی شما تاریخ را تغییر داده است. شما در خط مقدم آزادی ایستاده اید و ما از همیشه به پایان این رژیم نزدیکتریم. این رژیم ترک برداشته است. قدرتش فرسوده شده. سقوطش آغاز شده است. به خودتان ایمان داشته باشید، به اتحادتان، به شجاعتتان، به بزرگیتان. این رژیم دیگر نمیتواند ملت بیدار و برخاسته ما را خاموش کند. نمیتواند ترس را بر ایران حاکم کند. این رژیم از شما و قدرتتان میترسد. ما اجازه نمیدهیم اندوهمان به ناامیدی تبدیل شود. هم میهنانم سوگ از دست دادن بهترین فرزندان ایران سنگین است، اما ما این سوگ را به خشم آگاهانه و اراده شکست ناپذیر علیه خامنه‌ای و همه عاملان داخلی و خارجیش تبدیل می‌کنیم. آماده باشید، لحظه بازگشت به خیابان فرا خواهد رسید. گسترده تر، قدرتمندتر، مصممتر از همیشه. برای فتح تهران، برای بازپسگیری ایران، ادامه این نبرد تا پیروزی نهایی، نه فقط یک وظیفه ملی که عهدی است با جان باختگان راه آزادی و خون پاکشان. نامشان فراموش نخواهد شد، نه در تاریخ، نه در حافظه ملی، نه در قلب ما. آن روز دور نیست، روزی که با هم جشن بازپسگیری ایران را میگیریم و با سربلندی میگوییم ایستادیم، جنگیدیم و پیروز شدیم. پاینده ایران.
No, I wasn't successful in that particular election, but I haven't forgotten the conversations nor the responsibility. And this legislation is a complete demonstration of the failure of leadership of the Prime Minister in managing this. The fact that the legislation was tabled a week ago, nobody had seen it, he hadn't come to the opposition, who had indicated for a considerable period of time since Bondi that we were prepared to work with the government as the Australian people wanted us to do, to make some changes. But the Prime Minister, despite calling for us to come together, has done nothing and failed to actually do the things that would bring us together. He mocked the coalition, he criticised the coalition, and quite frankly, in calling for us to come together while not bringing us together, was gaslighting the opposition. Gaslighting the Jewish community, in fact, gaslighting the Australian community. A complete failure of leadership. And for him to now try and compare this legislation and some of its actions with John Howard, who actually did bring the country together, who got bipartisan support and the National Party to agree to the legislation in 1996, is actually quite offensive, that he tries to appropriate the actions of John Howard in this debate. Because in this sense, he has completely failed. There are a number of measures in this legislation that we should have been able to agree on. And there are others that, with some improvement, could have formed some very sound legislation. But of course, Labor think they know better. And I really wonder who they were actually listening to when they built this legislation. They clearly weren't listening to their own backbench, because up until this morning, this legislation prohibited a piece of equipment that Olympians use in Olympic competition. So who were they listening to? Who were Labor listening to in developing this legislation? And when they tell us that this will have no impact on farmers and rural Australians, and when they tell us that this will have no impact on sporting shooters, I don't believe them. And why should I? Because the evidence is completely to the contrary. Why would I? Because they don't even know what the impact is. They have no understanding. And we hear it so often in the trotted out talking points that they run in this debate in relation to this matter. They have no concept of what tools are required by farmers to manage browsing on their farms, or the different forms of browsing, different firearm that you might need to deal with wallabies or wild deer, or, as Senator Mackenzie said earlier, wild pigs. And so the limitations, the artificial limitations on the number of firearms available are a limitation on the toolkit available to farmers and Australians, rural Australians, in managing their farms. They say that if you're not a citizen, you won't be able to get access to firearms. Well, what about the non-citizen farmers? What about the Australian residents who run farms? And I know some. They're not Australian residents, but they have the same problem as every other farmer in managing feral wildlife. That's not considered as part of this legislation. What about the non-resident Australian farming workforce that also assist? Senator Steele-John was talking about managing feral animals in parts of Western Australia. And I'm sure that some non-resident farmhands are assisting with that role, that very important role. But of course, under this legislation, they can't, because they won't be allowed to have a firearm licence. They're excluded under the simple fix. So this government have no idea what they're legislating. They have no understanding of the unintended consequences in this legislation. So why should anybody trust them when they say it will have no impact on farmers? We know it will. What about those farmers who reload their shells? If they want to use a carriage device to find information about reloading the shells appropriately so that they get the right amount of shot in the shell, that's an offence under this legislation. We're not sure about the impact of that. What if an Olympian finds out that in the United States there's a new technology around reloading shells that gives the Americans an advantage? Are they going to be impacted? This lot don't know. They can't tell us. And nobody was consulted. I was listening to the evidence at the hearings last week. They have no idea what they're legislating here. So why should we trust them? I don't believe them when they say nobody's going to be impacted, because they don't know themselves. They don't know themselves. So why should we pass bad legislation? But it's a pattern that we've sadly grown used to with this government: a failure of leadership, a failure to bring us together, failure of consultation, and in this circumstance, a failure to genuinely understand. Acting Deputy President, here's a photograph through a scope of browsing pressure on a farm in Tasmania. There's hardly room to put a sheep or a cow on that farm in between the browsing animals. Farmers need to have the right tools to be able to manage their properties properly. On that same farm, where all those wallabies are competing with grass that might be used for sheep or cattle, is a vineyard. And the next day there's deer in the vineyard, wild deer. Different firearm required for the wallabies, to the deer, or perhaps the birds that might come in and take the grapes off the vines at different times of the year. Farmers need to have the toolkit. They need to be able to have the toolkit, and I don't believe the government when they say this legislation won't restrict them, because it's clear to me that there are unintended consequences, and the fact that until this morning an Olympian couldn't have a jacket that would hold 50 shells, which is Olympic requirement, because they were restricted to 30. And in terms of the buyback, another example of the failure of leadership of this government. And as I said before, it's offensive that the government try to appropriate John Howard's buyback in their arguments for this buyback. Because what John Howard did was work with the states, set up a process, made sure that appropriate payment for the firearms was paid, supported small business, and then he paid for it. He paid for it all. He didn't just announce it and say, by the way, to the states, you're paying half, without having had no consultation first, which is what this government did. I mean, this government talks about us coming together and a time for us to come together, and yet they have done nothing to bring us together. And they present us with this flawed legislation, and I'm not surprised that they've done the political deal that they've done with the Greens, because they have no care for Australian farmers. And here we are with this bad and flawed legislation, which I cannot support. And it's a sad situation, because had the Prime Minister gone to the Leader of the Opposition in the days and weeks after the terrible events at Bondi and worked with her and other members of the Parliament, we should have been standing in this place today with an agreement on legislation which we all understood and which did the job that we wanted it to do. And it is a failure of leadership of the Prime Minister that we are not in that situation. It is a very, very sad situation for us to be in, because with genuine leadership, this legislation could have been so much better, and it could have been something that we all supported. As I have said, there are a number of things in this legislation that we should be able to agree on. The background checks, some of the controls. But because of the failure of leadership of this government, we're not in a position to be able to do that, and therefore I'm not in a position to support the legislation.
Senator Pocock.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. I rise to speak to this bill and foreshadow a second reading amendment in my name and in the names of Senators Lambie, Tyrrell, Payman and Thorpe. I begin by again expressing my deep condolences to the victims of the horrific ISIS-inspired anti-Semitic terrorist attack in Bondi and that targeted members of the Jewish community, to the families who lost loved ones, to those who were injured, and to a community that's been left shaken and grieving. Our thoughts remain with you. What occurred in Bondi was not just an attack on individuals, it was an attack on a community, an attack on the freedom to live worship and gather without fear, and it has left a deep scar on our country. The men who perpetrated that atrocity should never, ever have been able to access firearms. Australians are united in the wake of that tragedy. We must do everything in our power to ensure that this never happens again. But before I turn to the substance of this bill, I want to acknowledge a broader truth. Trust in politicians and in government in this country is bad and is getting worse. And frankly, after what we've seen in the Parliament in recent days, it's not hard to see why. Australians expect this Parliament to act decisively, but they also expect us to act carefully and consult effectively, to actually collaborate and ensure that we are passing good laws. At its core, this bill seeks to do something that Australians overwhelmingly support, to prevent firearms from falling into the hands of terrorists and others who seek to do harm. That principle is totally uncontroversial. Australians want strong firearms laws. We want dangerous weapons kept out of dangerous hands, and they want governments at every level to work together to make that happen. Over the weekend, I surveyed people here in the ACT, and nearly 1,000 people responded. 80% told me that they support or strongly support state and territory firearm buyback schemes backed by the federal government, and 93% support or strongly support stronger import controls on firearms. That is overwhelming support for stronger action. But the hundreds of thousands of responsible, law-abiding firearm owners must not be treated as collateral damage in our response to terrorism. Farmers, pest controllers, sporting shooters, veterans, people who use firearms legally and responsibly for agriculture, for invasive species control, and for recreation, these Australians are not the problem. And many of them are deeply unsettled right now. Many of them are angry. Many of them feel attacked by this legislation and by the lack of detail and time for consultation with people in that community. Because the way that this bill is being rushed through the Parliament, there has been minimal consultation. There's been limited scrutiny, and this has created a vacuum of information. And in that vacuum, we've seen uncertainty, we've seen confusion, we've seen misinformation. And I've heard directly from people that I represent here in the ACT who feel under attack, who do not understand what these laws will mean for them, who are struggling to get clear answers from the government. That is not how good laws are made. Yesterday, I held 2 roundtables to hear from people across the spectrum on this issue. I heard strong support for the intent of this bill, but I also heard serious, very legitimate concerns. I heard from gun control advocates who told me that without proper resourcing and enforcement, legislative change alone will not deliver the outcomes that we need. I heard from community advocates that any reform to the regulation of firearms should also look at how we can continue efforts to stop family, domestic and gendered violence. I heard from organisations representing firearm owners who told me that they have deep concern about implementation, about vague definitions, about procedural fairness and about uncertainty around compensation. Many questions remain with this legislation, and the farcical way that the Labor government has decided to deal with this legislation, where there will likely be no committee of the whole, there'll be no time to actually ask questions to clarify some of these concerns, means that these questions will likely remain. Will buybacks offer fair market value for firearms and ammunition? What about ammunition? If firearms are bought back, what happens to the hundreds of thousands of shells out there, of ammunition out there? What happens to the small businesses that may be forced to shut their doors due to changes at a state and territory level? What exactly is captured by terms like firearms and explosives manufacturing material in the context of these new offences? Does that apply to farmers, to pest controllers who are reloading at home. Very hard to get any clarity on that. Where is the funding for security agencies, law enforcement and home affairs to implement the scheme? I've been banging on about resourcing for the AFP for the last 3.5 years. If this is important, we've got to resource it. We have to resource it better. And these aren't fringe concerns. They are reasonable questions, and too many of them remain unanswered. Outside the legislation, questions are being asked about why it's taken so long to stand up a national firearms register. Here in the ACT, more than 4,000 gun licences are administered on a paper-based system. A paper-based system in 2026. One part of this bill that I do unequivocally welcome is the strengthening of information sharing and background checks. If we are serious about preventing another atrocity like Bondi, then intelligence must flow more effectively between agencies. The federal government has a clear role to play here in coordination between ASIO, the AFP, state and territory police, firearm registries. The federal government also has an important role in strengthening import controls and in supporting nationally consistent approaches to buybacks. Stopping acts of terror requires preventing those who wish to commit acts of evil from accessing the tools to carry it out. But support for the intent and for the majority of the provisions of this bill does not excuse a failure of process. Ramming complex legislation through Parliament without adequate consultation undermines trust. That is why, while I support this bill, I cannot ignore the serious deficiencies in how it has been handled. We owe it to the victims of the Bondi attack, to the Jewish community and to all Australians, including those who lawfully own and use firearms, to get this right. For that reason, I will move a motion that, once passed, this bill be referred to the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Legislation Committee for inquiry to report by the 2nd of March 2026. That inquiry will allow this Senate to hear from the community, to test the legislation, to identify unintended consequences, and to make any necessary amendments without delaying the urgent protections Australians rightly expect. I will also put forward an amendment to establish an independent statutory review of this legislation in 2 years' time. I'm hopeful that these amendments put forward in good faith will help to improve public trust in these laws and in our political process. Just over a month ago, we witnessed the worst terrorist attack on Australian shores in our history, targeting the Jewish community. It was an attack that shook our nation, and I support this bill as part of the response to that attack, but there is much more that needs to be done to combat anti-Semitism and to combat all forms of hate, and we must never lose sight of that.
Senator Cadell.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. And I will be shorter than my allocated time here because I know many people wish to talk, but I do want to address some things that have been said. I would like to start by saying something that I know is controversial, but I mean it. If you were to seek to punish 813,000 Muslims in Australia after this attack, you would be called an extremist because you would be. Fair and simple. But if you want to punish 940,000 gun owners in this country for what happened, you are the Prime Minister. And that is unfair. It is unfair that a group of people who have done nothing are being punished for something they have never done. And when we heard some of the things Senator Pocock said, really across party lines and across everything, we hear about gun buybacks and we hear about potential for the capping of state funds out there. So if you went to Southern Cross Firearms and bought a Taipan X for $1,800 yesterday or the day before this happened, do you get $500 back for it? You mentioned ammunition. If I go and buy Barnes 416 Rigby ammunition, I buy a box of that, 20 of those, $20 a round. I have $400 in a single box of ammunition. So where does that go to protect the people who have done the right thing? No one should be able to group punish. I remember in school, someone did something stupid in school. We got all held back. We hated that kid, right? But we are group punishing again here, and it is unfair. I do not blame the Greens for being consistent in their policy position of supporting these bills. They are consistent, they are where they are, and they want to do. I blame the government for rushing this through, us being told that it was not for changing. We are not splitting this, and we are not changing this. We are here, it is being split, and I can't keep up with the changes from the 4 different versions that were yesterday, the one that came in at 6:13 this morning, where things like the importation of sporting apparel changes, where there was a ban last night, and I think even this morning first thing, for belts, ammunition and clothing that can hold more than 30 rounds. Well, my Levi's can hold 30 22s in their pocket. My Wranglers can hold 30 rounds of 22 in their pocket. Now, that's changed. We are talking about the reaction of banning the importation of gel blaster beads as a reaction to a terrorist attack. Gel blasting, which is a sport in Queensland, much like paintball, much like any other things like that. We're talking about banning gel blaster beads as a response to a terrorist attack. And this is not fair. This is not a position that the government is trying to make the problem go away for Australian people. This is a problem where the government's trying to make the political problem go away for a Prime Minister. That is what this is about. Coming back early to discuss, to be sensible, to do what this place does best, and we have seen it in many times where we have worked together to get solutions that are important, has happened. To come back to be given a bill of take it or leave it, no consultation, then change it, is ridiculous. It is ridiculous. And we sit here, another bill coming this afternoon, and I don't think anyone in this chamber is absolutely for or against either of these bills. It is nuanced, some of these positions, but we have to make a binary choice, yes or no. And on this ammunition bill, I hear people getting up from the other side saying about this bill will stop non-citizens getting firearms. It will not. It does nothing about that whatsoever, but they want to pretend it does. It doesn't do that. That is a state basis because, as was said before, state and territories have the point on this. When we are talking about a buyback program that doesn't have the buy-in of all the states yet, we have a number of states saying they're not involved, it goes against the gun accord, it goes against all of these things, and it is wrong. So, people in the Hunter Valley, where I come from, so many hunters up there, you know, I could name some of my friends who have weapons now who have to give them back. I talked about that Taipan straight bull, Taipan X from Southern Cross Firearms. It is not a self-loading rifle. It is not a repeating rifle. It is a straight pull. It is potentially a pump pull. It is a good sporting weapon for recreational hunting and pest eradication. And now that is illegal in New South Wales and not part of this, but now you can't import it either. So if I am a hunter, if I am a target shooter, if I am a sport shooter, I am limited in what I can get. There are still questions about whether all the weapons used in the Olympic events, especially around the pistols, are able to import all parts of these things. It is a positive thing that there is finally funding after 3.5 years for the National Register. That is a good thing. I don't pretend it is not, but we have had 3.5 years to fund that. So to all my friends, to all those people out there, to the 60-odd, 4,000 people that we got in trouble for carrying the non-compliant petition for earlier today, I say to you, I am sorry that we haven't been able to stop this to make this better. There are definitely things that we support in that, like the ASIO checks, like the National Register, but there is some stuff in there that has just been in the bottom drawer of a wish list of a bureaucrat who doesn't like guns, who wants to get them out. And it is not the crossbench fault, it is not the Greens' fault, it is not this side's fault. It is the Labor Party's fault for wanting a political problem to go away quickly and not a policy solution. So to the 940,000 registered gun owners out there, I am sorry for what is happening to you. It is being done unfairly, it is being done quickly, and it is being done without due process. And I will not vote for that. I cannot vote for that. And you need to know Who is to blame for that? And it is solely the government.
Senator Hodgins-May.
Thank you, Deputy President. Gun reform is certainly not the whole solution to keeping us safer, but it is a crucial first step, taking away one of the most dangerous tools used to cause harm. It is a step that I would have assumed uncontroversial in the wake of the tragic events in Bondi. That is why this bill has the support of the Australian Greens. Right now, Australia's firearms laws contain serious loopholes. Loopholes that allow gun owners to endlessly recycle the same justification to accumulate dozens, and in some cases hundreds of guns. No sensible regime should allow what are basically private arsenals of this scale to exist in our suburbs. It is entirely indefensible. A farmer needs access to a gun, sure. One gun, a few guns, for legitimate purposes. But 100 guns? Why? To the opposition senators opposing these reforms, I ask a simple question. Why does a farmer need 100 guns? This isn't just about whether ownership is technically lawful. It is about scale, concentration and risk. It is also about the very real possibility of firearms being stolen or misused. Every year, more than 2,000 guns are stolen. That is one gun every 4 hours. Most illegal guns come from thefts of legally owned firearms. To put it simply, the more legal guns there are, the more illegal guns end up in the wrong hands. We cannot talk honestly about gun reform without recognising the warning signs that have too often gone unheard. For decades, women and domestic violence survivors have warned us about the danger of firearms in violent homes. They've told us again and again that access to guns escalates threats in fertilities, and yet our own gun laws have remained too weak and too fragmented. We also cannot ignore the influence of the gun lobby in this country. Per capita, it spends amounts comparable and by some measures even higher than the NRA in the United States. And just like in the US, that influence has worked to stall reform and normalise dangerous levels of gun ownership in Australia. How many debates do we have to have in this place where major party and One Nation politicians argue positions against the interests of their own communities because of dodgy political donations? Fossil fuels, gambling, guns. Take the donations away and then you honestly tell me that you would oppose these reforms. We are watching in real time the consequences of weak gun laws elsewhere. Rising political violence, extremism becoming normalised, mass shootings treated as inevitable. When Australians see mass shootings in America, we look at the lack of action from politicians in the pockets of the gun lobby and thank our lucky stars that we don't have politicians like that here. Well, we do. A mass shooting happens and here we have politicians opposing gun laws while accepting donations from the gun lobby. Is this the Australian Senate or is this America? Those are not values that Australians accept. That is not the future Australians want. It is time our policy and our leadership catch up. The Greens have consistently, always recognised that legitimate needs must be respected in gun law reform and that any reform must reflect that reality. But the Greens do not accept, and we do not believe the Australian public accepts, that any one private citizen has a genuine reason to own dozens or hundreds of guns. The buyback contained in this bill will begin to right this course. When I think about what happened in Bondi, I feel a deep mix of grief and anger. Grief for the lives lost, grief for the families and communities who will never be the same, and anger, real anger, that once again we are here after another act of devastating violence, asking ourselves what we could have done differently. I also feel an overwhelming responsibility, and the Greens feel an overwhelming responsibility. A responsibility not to reach for platitudes and not to hide behind symbolism, but to act decisively and seriously in a way that genuinely reduces the risk of this happening again. If we mean what we say when we say this isn't us, then we must be prepared to take difficult, concrete steps. And taking dangerous weapons off our streets and out of our communities isn't radical, it's rational. It is the most basic act of harm prevention. And it is an essential first step in stopping violence like what we witnessed in Bondi. In Victoria, my home state, there are around 960,000 registered firearms owned by more than 236,000 people. And look, these numbers are higher than before the Port Arthur massacre. As the daughter of a fourth-generation farmer, I understand deeply that there are legitimate reasons for firearm ownership in this country. Farmers participate in legitimate regulated activities, and of course no one is disputing this. But when I look at this data, I feel alarmed, because what we are seeing goes far beyond legitimate use. We know from Port Arthur what decisive gun reform can achieve. After that tragedy, Australia acted, and it saved lives. More recently, our neighbours in Aotearoa showed that governments can act swiftly and with moral courage after an Islamophobic mass shooting carried out by a white Australian. Those reforms sent a clear message. The tools of mass violence do not belong in our society. What a shame it is then that this reform is not treated as a shared national responsibility today. What a shame that the National Party would rather engage in culture wars than commit across party lines to getting unnecessary guns out of our communities and off our streets. This issue should not be partisan. I also recognise today, after work from the Greens, my colleagues, the agreement to establish a National Firearm Safety Council as another step towards meaningful gun safety. And I want to thank my colleague Senator Shoebridge and Senator Larissa Waters for their leadership in that area. These reforms must be our first step. But of course we can't pretend that they're the only ones. Because when I look at my home state of Victoria, particularly in the weeks of horror after Bondi, I feel something else as well, and I feel pride. Pride in its diversity, pride in its resilience. Because in the days and weeks after Bondi, I saw communities come together across faiths and across cultures. Solidarity matters. It reminds us that removing the tools of violence must go hand in hand with confronting hatred, extremism and social fracture before they take hold. But let me be very clear. Suppressing democratic freedoms, protecting some groups over others, or vilifying migrants will not make us safer. It will do quite the opposite. Knee-jerk reactions from Labor that follow the coalition down this twisted path of culture wars and divisions do not make us safer. They will not make us safer. So yes, we must take back firearms as tools of destruction and violence and chaos. But we must make sure that what we do today isn't just symbolic, but serious and grounded in evidence, in courage, and a refusal to accept the slow drift towards violence as normal.
Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Acting Deputy Chair. Well, I've returned this week, hopefully with the same intent of other senators, that what we should be doing here in this shortened day is to take actions that would reduce the risk of the horrific events of the 14th of December happening again. I don't support this bill because I don't see a significant link here between what we saw, the tragedy of what we saw, and what we are doing here today. In fact, much of what we are doing here today seems completely irrelevant to those issues, and perhaps instead the pursuit of a broader agenda that has sought to demonise the otherwise legal recreational use of firearms in this country. I've listened to some of the debate this afternoon and this evening, and I have heard it said often that, well, the the evil monsters there on the 14th of December that committed these acts, they would be breaking the law if we passed these laws. If we passed these laws, one of the assailants was a foreign citizen, and foreign citizens won't be able to have guns anymore, so December 14th couldn't have happened. I can't accept that level of naivety as a reason to pass laws to restrict rights on the rest of law-abiding Australians. Those two people, those two murderers, were breaking the law already. They were terrorists, they were murderers, they were killers, they were criminals. And the idea then that somehow passing a law to make something illegal is going to stop crime does seem the height of naivety. And if it was that simple, why don't we just pass a law banning all crime and everything will be peaceful, apparently. Those two individuals we know now were very committed to do what the evil they did. They possibly, well, we have seen, they did train. They did train to do what they did. They possibly went to the Philippines and continued that training. They went to great lengths to commit the acts of evil that they did just over a month ago. The idea somehow that in the future, any two similar murderers with a warped mind, an evil intent, could not somehow find a way around the laws we're passing today, it indicates that we are not approaching this issue with the seriousness of what happened over a month ago. There are millions of illegal firearms in this country. We know there are hundreds of thousands of them possibly in Western Sydney, where these two murderers came from. The idea they couldn't get their hands on something that was illegal, it's just absurd. It's totally ridiculous. So these, whatever provisions are here in particular, is not really going to tackle the major issue that confronted this nation over a month ago. Yet it was this issue, it was gun law reform, as the government describes it, that the Prime Minister first latched onto in his response. Within days of this terrible event, the greatest terrorist attack in Australia's history, within days, the Prime Minister was latching on to the issue of guns, almost certainly, transparently, as a means to avoid having to confront the more difficult issue for himself and his political party of the spread of radical Islamic extremism inspired by anti-Semitism that this government has done far too little about. And so that already, of course, that did. The Prime Minister's initial bumbling of this issue has left a bad taste in the mouth of those Australians that do use guns. Use guns for work, use guns for pleasure. It's not illegal to do that. There has not been good faith from the Prime Minister or the Labor Party on this issue, because from the get-go, they sought to demonise gun owners as somehow contributing to the risks of this event, when that was, I think, to most Australians, completely absurd. Now, because of that public pressure, because that initial response was so cynical, was so transparently desperate, the Australian people didn't buy it. They didn't buy it. I mean, I think the Australian people could see after the Port Arthur massacre, they saw a Prime Minister who was taking on his own political base, who was tackling a difficult issue. There were assault and or semi-automatic weapons available out in the general public then. So they saw a legitimate issue that the then Howard government was taking on, a tough issue, but one they took on. This time, very clearly, the Australian public saw that this was very political and not really a serious response to what happened. Yet, here we are, just a few weeks later, and the first bill the government has proposed, after splitting their broader bill, it's a complete shambles, we'll get to later. This bill that they're proposing tackles not the root cause of what happened on December 14th. It tackles a whole lot of ancillary issues that don't go anywhere close to what happened on the 14th of December or the days leading up to it. And it has led to the demonisation of 1 million Australians who own firearms, sometimes because they have to for work, sometimes because they enjoy the pastime and the pursuit. And we have heard of, just in the previous speech, we've heard Acting Deputy Speaker that this is not a time to demonise fellow Australians or divide fellow Australians. We've all got to come together and unify, except if you own a gun. If you own a gun, apparently, you can be demonised. You can be judged. You can be prejudged. You can be prejudged that because you may collect guns or have more than 5, apparently the people I think have never shot a gun seem to understand how many guns you need. If you have more than 5, you're an evil person, you're a terrible person, you're a risk to society, you're a public enemy. Well, don't give me this rubbish of uniting. Don't give me this veneer of saying we're all Australians after this event when you make your response to it transparently politically divisive, to divide some Australians against others. And I completely understand, someone who doesn't own guns myself, rarely shot a gun. I don't mind doing it, it's a bit of fun, but it's not my main pastime in life. But we've got to get over this idea that just because I don't do it or I don't like it, I should take it away from a fellow Australian, stop them doing it. Because there are a lot of people in this country that legally pursue these things. We cheer them on when they win gold medals at the Olympics or the Commonwealth Games. We're happy for them then. But when it suits us politically, we'll say that they're the problem and distract then from the more difficult discussions that we might get to later tonight, which are also being glossed over on another story. You can tell, as I said before, you can tell the government is not serious about this, is not taking this issue with the due consideration it should be, through both the completely irrelevant provisions that are in this particular bill and the fact that in the last day or two, the government's had to drop a whole lot of changes because it didn't consult properly on its initial bill released only a week ago. This bill had restrictions on how many shells you could hold in a vest. I think it was limited at 30 rounds in a particular vest. You wouldn't be able to, in the initial drafting of this bill, you wouldn't be able to import a vest that had more than 30 rounds. Took someone to point out to the government, well, you know, if you want to practice for the Olympics, you want to compete at the AIS down the road, you actually do need more than 30 rounds to do that. No one had checked that. No one had checked that in the government. Right? Now, they thankfully have removed that provision, but the problem when you do these last-minute amendments is you start as a legislator to think, well, what other gremlins are in this bill? What other things haven't they thought of properly here? Because that is so silly, it should have been picked up in any first early consultations that clearly have not happened before we got here. This bill also, for some unknown reason, goes after people who use gel blasters. Now, I'm not the expert on this. I don't know if I have shot a gun, as I've said, but I don't know if I've ever even shot a gel blaster before. There's a group in Rocky where I live, I know, do it all. Seem like good people. They put on parties and events and team bonding stuff you can do. Good luck to people. But why is that in this bill? Why is it? I don't know. I don't know if we're having a committee stage. Is everything just getting guillotined? Perhaps the minister can tell us. Has there been an incident in this country ever involving a gel blaster with a fatality? Has a terrorist organisation or group ever sought to acquire gel blasters to commit acts of terror? When they do it with cars, they do it with homemade bombs, and now, unfortunately, they've done it with some guns. But have they done it with gel blasters? And if not, why is that in here? Because this goes to show that this has obviously been a laundry list of things that certain people have wanted to get done, and they've just chucked it in. They've just chucked in this bill because they didn't think people would be watching. And worse, quite in quite a contemptful fashion, they have used a national tragedy, the worst terrorist attack on our shores ever, to pursue an unrelated agenda under the guise of trying to do something about terrorism. That's what's happening here. That's what the government has done to people who are otherwise law-abiding citizens. The government here hasn't thought through the provisions around a national gun buyback. They're trying to force this through. It's very much putting the cart before the horse because most states haven't even signed up to a buyback yet. There is time to put funds in place if and when that ever happens. But by rushing this here, the government has not seemingly considered, well, why wouldn't ammunition be part of that buyback like it was in the original buyback? That's not included at all. Some simple details have been glossed over by this government. So that is why, for all these reasons, that's why the Nationals Party and the Liberal Party will not be voting for these laws. They will not appreciably reduce the risk of a terrorist attack happening again on our shores. Terrorists are unlikely to be the kind of people that are going to obey the law in any event. We would be much more sensible for us to focus on the root cause of what's happened here at Bondi, which is these evil ideas, the anti-Semitic ideas, the divisive ideas, the hateful ideas that lead to violence. Focus on that instead of reducing the rights of other Australians who have done nothing wrong. And on the gun issue, on the issue itself, what clearly should happen is for a renewed effort to clamp down on organised crime. Because, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of focus on the fact that there's more legal firearms in Australia since Port Arthur, although I'm indebted to my colleague Senator McDonald, who has pointed out that there's much fewer actually per person. Number of firearms in this country has fallen. Don't hear that. But for all the focus on the legal firearm market, there's almost an ignorance and unwillingness to look at the fact that we have enormous numbers of illegal firearms in this country that are controlled largely by criminal gangs and organised crime that is growing like topsy in our country right now because we've created enormous lines of businesses for these groups through our ineptitude on tobacco policy, our pig-headedness on vaping policy, our distractions then away from illicit drugs and substances that have given those organisations enormous streams of money to import all kinds of contraband into this country, including presumably illegal firearms out there. And this brings my final point that I worry a bit that by rushing something like a national gun buyback, how are we going to be sure that this won't be abused as well? I mean, we've seen, well, not just this government, but the Commonwealth government fail to run basic programs time and time again. The NDIS has become a pot of gold for people doing the wrong thing, as seemingly has some of the childcare funding that's massively increased recently as well. And I worry here that setting up a gun buyback scheme in a rushed fashion without considering all the details of it could easily be an ability for people. I mean, what's stopping someone from importing a gun and then going to sell it in the buyback and making a heaps of money? I mean, I'm told that did happen apparently in the first round of the buyback, but this could be on steroids here because we've rushed this, haven't got the details right, are still changing it within hours of this bill passing this evening. And that's why we should reject this bill. We should, if we have to, support my colleague Senator McKenzie's amendment to push this to a Senate inquiry and get the details right and consider it in more detail. But right here, right now, tonight, this is not going to reduce the risk of another terrorist attack. It's only going to take away rights from Australians, and for that reason it should be voted down.
Senator Bell. To every law-abiding firearm owner and to every Australian watching what is happening right now, One Nation's position on this legislation and this policy issue is very straightforward. One Nation supports law-abiding gun owners. And One Nation believes we should be punishing extremists and not punishing law-abiding gun owners. The Albanese Labor government has dumped this major gun reform package, and they are expecting everyone to simply accept this while ignoring the normal processes of scrutiny. And the truth is the people who will be affected by this first will not be terrorists or criminals. It will be you. It will be farmers. It will be regional Australians. It will be pest controllers. It'll be sporting shooters. It'll be collectors. It will be licence holders, law-abiding citizens who have never committed a crime in their lives and who would never commit a crime. They will be the one who will be punished. These are the people, they do the training. They keep their firearms secure. They comply with inspections and they live by the law. And to those people, know that you are not the problem and we have your back. Because One Nation knows that criminals do not line up for gun buybacks. Criminals do not register illegal weapons. Criminals do not care about new paperwork, new rules, or new announcements. They operate in the shadows through trafficking, importation, and organised crime, and they will keep doing it while the government is focused on quick headlines instead of criminals. I'll say it again, One Nation's position is straightforward. We support law-abiding gun owners. One Nation believes we need to punish extremists, not shooters. We need to punish the root cause of the things that happened in Bondi, radical Islamic extremism, not law-abiding Australians who have never committed a crime in their life. If the Albanese Labor government was genuinely concerned about public safety, it needs to be honest about this. It needs to be honest about what is driving the violence that we saw in Bondi and this extremism, and we should be confronting it directly. We should not be dodging it with vague language and political slogans. Unfortunately, what we've seen is Labor's instinct has been to punish people who are already doing the right thing. Law-abiding Australians who have never committed and never would commit a crime in their life. And the other issue is here, One Nation is not prepared to sign you up for a blank cheque. We actually don't know how much this is going to cost. We know that the states, a lot of them are rejecting this proposal. We know that in Queensland, Northern Territory and Tasmania, they're not on board with this. Here is what One Nation wants instead. We want policies that actually target criminals and protect the public. That is how you improve safety, not by scapegoating farmers and licence holders, not by punishing law-abiding Australians, not by pretending criminals and terrorists will comply with a gun buyback. And so again, to the law-abiding firearm community, One Nation hears you and we will stand with you. And to the wider public, do not be fooled by this farce. Do not be fooled, because real safety comes from confronting the cause of the threats and enforcing laws against criminals, not cracking down on the people who are already abiding by the law. One Nation opposes this buyback, and we will keep fighting for common sense and fairness. We will keep standing with farmers, regional Australians, pest controllers, sporting shooters and collectors. We are not about to support a policy. We don't know how many billions it's going to cost, and it's in the billions. How many regional hospitals could we be funding?
Thank you, Senator Bell. Your time has expired. Pursuant to order agreed to yesterday, the time allotted for the debate on this bill has expired. I will now put the question before the Chair and then put the questions on the remaining stages of the bill. The question before the Chair relates to the second reading amendment moved by Senator Mackenzie. That amendment on sheet 3607. So the question is that that amendment be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Against? No. I believe the noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes. Lock the doors. So the question is that amendment on sheet 3607, as moved by Senator McKenzie, be agreed to. The ayes shall move to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint Senator Askew as teller for the ayes and Senator Damanen as teller for the noes. Order. There being 28 ayes and 34 noes, the matter is resolved in the negative. I advise senators that if further divisions are required, the bells will be rung for 1 minute only. I will now deal with the second reading amendment circulated by Senator Thorpe. The question is that the amendment on sheet 3614 be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Against? I believe the noes have it. Yes, Senator Shoebridge?
Just record the Greens' support for that second reading.
Certainly, so no division required. Thank you. I will now deal with the second reading amendment circulated by Senators David Pocock, Lambie, Payman and Tyrrell. The question is that the amendment on sheet 3611 be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Against? I believe the noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. Lock the doors. The question is that the amendment on sheet 3611 be agreed to. The ayes shall move to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint Senator Askew as teller for the ayes and Senator Darmanin as teller for the noes. Order. There being 29 ayes and 33 noes, the matter is resolved in the negative. The question now is that the bill be now read a second time. Those of that opinion say aye. Against? I believe the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I call the clerk.
Bill for an act to amend legislation relating to customs and background checking and to create a scheme to buy back firearms and for related purposes.
I will now deal with the Committee of the Whole amendments, starting with the amendments circulated by the Nationals. The first question is that subsections 54E in brackets 3 and brackets 4 and subsections 54J brackets 4 and brackets 5 in item 24, Division 1 of Part 5 and Part 6 of Schedule 2 stand as printed. Those of that opinion say aye. Against? I believe the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. Lock the doors. So the first question is that subsections 54E bracket 3 and bracket 4 and subsections 54J bracket 4 and bracket 5 in item 24, Division 1 of Part 5 and Part 6 of Schedule 2 stand as printed. The ayes shall move to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint Senator Darmanin as teller for the ayes and Senator Askew as teller for the noes. Senator Grogan, you need to be sitting down. Senator Grogan, you need to be sitting down. You're not appointed a teller. Order. There being 38 ayes and 26 noes, the matter is resolved in the affirmative. The question now is that the remaining amendments on sheets 3597 and 3602 and the amendments on sheets 3593 and 3594, 3601 and 3603 be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Against? I believe the noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute.